For those of you starting to hop on, we're just going to give a few minutes for folks to be able to join. But miigwech, thank you so much to those who have already joined for joining us. We'll get started in just one more minute. Thanks to everyone who's already joined the feed. We appreciate it. All right, now that it's a little after 1 here in Central Time, I think we can go ahead and get started. Bojo, Maribel Zook Nadesh Nakas, Ottawatomie and Dow, Shawnee, Oklahoma, and Dochbia. Hello, everyone. My name is Maribel Zook, and I am the Communications Director at the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. And I just wanted to say, miigwech, thank you so much for joining us here today for the release of the report that we have put together that's called Facilitating True Nation-to-Nation Dialogue, a Guide to Effective and Meaningful Consultation with Tribal Governments. So we are so excited to have you here today. I also wanted to take a moment to introduce Tish, who's also on our communications team. She's going to be assisting us today, and she serves as our communications manager. So miigwech, Tish, for being able to help us out. As a reminder, you guys are streaming live across IFAI's Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, and you can ask questions throughout by commenting on the post that you're watching on. So as we're going, if you have something you want to ask, feel free to go and leave a comment, but we'll also have an opportunity at the end for a question and answer as well. And if you happen to be watching this recording after it's been live, we will have some contact information at the end. If you have questions and you want to get in touch, please feel free to reach out to us. All right, so next slide. Here you can see the agenda for today. So we're going to go through some introductions and then dive into the highlights of our report that we put together. So first up, though, we're going to do some introductions. And I would like to introduce Erin Parker. She is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. Erin supports the initiative through program development, research and writing, and analysis of legislative and regulatory issues affecting tribal governments, business, and individual producers. So Erin, welcome so much to our feed today.
Thank you so much, Maribel, and thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited for the release of this guide and grateful to Mazon for their partnership on it. Excited to walk through it with you today.
Thank you, Erin. I also wanted to take a moment to introduce Carly Griffith-Hotvet. She is the Associate Executive Director here at the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. Carly is also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, as well as a seasoned legal professional admitted to practice in Oklahoma, Cherokee Nation, and Muskogee Creek Nation. Carly has an affinity for government law, agriculture, tribal policy, and public administration. So Carly, welcome to today's feed. You're on mute, Carly. I'll unmute you just real quick. Sorry about that. Okay. There you go.
Thank you. Osio Nagad, Carly Hotvet, Dagwado, like Mary said. Very excited to be releasing this guide on consultation, and a big wado to all of our staff who worked so hard on putting this together and making sure that We were sharing and communicating information to really bolster that consultation process and make sure that everybody involved is able to participate as fully as possible. We are hopeful that this guide will have a big impact and really help shore up that government to government relationship between the United States and our federally recognized tribes.
Thank you, Carly. And as a service organization, it is important that we take the time to thank those who make our work possible, because without the amazing support of so many folks out there, we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do in Indian country. And especially on this project, Mazon, A Jewish Response to Hunger, they have been so supportive of us getting this consultation guide put together. We really could not have done it without them. And I am so grateful that we have a representative from the organization with us today. So I would love to introduce Mia. Yes, thank you. Next slide. So Mia Hubbard is the Vice President of Programs at Mazon. And I'd just like to welcome her to the floor so she can give a couple comments.
Well, oh, am I muted? Okay, great. Thank you, Maribel. And just a big congratulations to all our colleagues at IFAI for this amazing piece of work. It's really clear from the guide that consultation is not only a legal obligation, but it's just good sound policy. And it's just a fantastic publication and provides a great framework for best practices and protocols from a tribal perspective on how to set a high bar for achieving meaningful, timely, and effective consultation. And it represents years of experience by IFAI staff who provide invaluable behind-the-scenes research, policy, and legal support to tribal leaders who come to consultations to advance their struggle for self-determination and food sovereignty. And so I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge IFAI's own leadership role in the success of USDA tribal consultations. And I also want to acknowledge just the visionary tribal leadership and advocacy that's at the center of every tribal consultation and really pushes them forward each year. Those leaders give voice to the needs of their people and compels changes in policies. They hold government officials accountable, and they've sought to broaden the reach of consultations with an eye toward improving outcomes for Indian country. Mazon has had the privilege of being at many tribal consultations over the years. So we've seen firsthand the hard work that takes place there, the challenging and difficult conversations that take place there. And while tribal consultations are largely focused on improving current programs and policies, because that's what exists now, tribal leaders are always pushing to get us beyond that status quo of today and to push and work for programs and policies in the future that will give tribes the autonomy, the authority, the decision-making power they need, and the U.S. resources and support to be able to advance their vision. So this is an exciting document that's going to help push that agenda forward. So on behalf of Mazon, I just want to thank IFAI for your exceptional work, for your partnership, and for the opportunity to be a part of this launch event.
Miigwech, Mia. Appreciate you being able to join us today. We're also grateful to have with us here today Chris Borden, and Chris is the Acting National Tribal Liaison from the United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources and Conservation Service. So Chris, we invite you to get on and say a few words. And again, Miigwech, thank you for being able to join us today. Oh, I think you're muted. Hold on, let me see if I can unmute you. There we go.
You can hear me now, I would imagine.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. I just like to express our appreciation for all those who are involved in the development of the guide. Looks like it's going to serve as a really remarkably important resource. And if it's okay with IFAI and the authors, we'd really be interested in incorporating this into the training, both for our consulting officials and for those who assist our consulting officials. Job consultation is a challenge outside of the 106 environment. National Historic Preservation Act environment. It's a continuing need for us to develop better sets of skills when it comes to tribal consultation. We had very successful tribal consultations, national tribal consultations in 2001, 2002, and 2003. But we know that one of the reasons that was as successful as it was is we had great help from USDA Office of Tribal Relations and IFAI and NCAI and others that kind of held our hand through that process and made it a success. So, but it's incumbent on us to become more effective in our tribal consultation, and we've seen how well things can work out from a helpful NRCS policy change standpoint, improving protocols for tribal knowledge to inform NRCS programs, better outreach to tribal producers. We've seen so many benefits when it was done right, and so we really value this as a resource to get us to the point where we can do it right more often. So thanks so much. Let us know who we owe lunch to.
Miigwech, thank you, Chris. And I think that would be a fantastic idea to be able to use this internally to help wherever possible. That was the intention of this. So glad that you guys are interested in using it. Again, Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and we're probably not the only USD agency who would hold that opinion. So thanks.
Thank you. All right. Now to get into the nuts and bolts of what today is. So I'm going to bring back on Aaron from IFAI to talk about what is tribal consultation, and then they'll get into highlighting the actual consultation guide. So Aaron.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maribel. Thanks to Chris for joining us and for those kind words where this, as Maribel said, that's exactly what this is designed for. So we're looking forward to continuing to work with NRCS and any USDA agency to use this guide for training, to answer questions that I know people have sometimes, especially when staff come in and they're unfamiliar with working in Indian country, or maybe they don't have a solid grounding in some of the concepts that I'm going to go over today. We hope that this can be that kind of resource going forward for staffs and facilitate that kind of government to government dialogue that leads to those solutions and problem solving and better relationship with tribal nations and USDA. But to get started with the guide, when you open the guide, one of the first things you'll see, you probably want to know what consultation is. So we're going to start there. This is the big question, right? What are we doing? So consultation, if you look at USDA's policies, there is a definition of it, which is helpful. USDA currently defines consultation as something that is timely, meaningful, and substantive dialogue between USDA officials with the delegated authority to consult and the official leadership of federally recognized Indian tribes or their designated representatives. There's some magic words in there that I definitely want to point to when we're thinking about what consultation is. For USDA, this means it's timely, it's substantive, and it's meaningful. It also means it occurs between officials at USDA and officials at federally recognized Indian tribes who have the authority to consult. And that's going to be pretty important when we talk about the legal foundation for consultation and why it exists. If you think about those words and that definition that USDA has for consultation, you probably noticed that most of those words have circumstances that can be met pretty objectively. Timeliness, for example, can be satisfied by following the guidance that's in the existing USDA regulations, or you can set your own timeline that may be faster than that. We always encourage people to use that as a floor and not a ceiling. More notice is always great for tribal leaders who are extremely busy governing their citizens and advocating for their health and safety and welfare. But you can objectively meet that timeliness standard. That one's kind of an easy one theoretically to do, assuming you get through clearance. I know that's an issue. However, there are also, you can easily verify that USDA officials have the authority to consult. You can make sure that federally recognized tribal leaders are invited. Those are kind of objective standards, but I think where it gets a little trickier to satisfy consultation requirements is looking at those subjective pieces, like making sure that consultation is both substantive and meaningful from a tribal leader's perspective. That's really kind of the heart of fulfilling some of the legal concepts that underlie consultation. And what we hope to provide in this guide is some practical advice for federal staff at USDA in how to meet those two subjective elements, especially in the best possible way, and also some practical guidance about meeting those objective standards as well along the way. So we think about how we got that definition that USDA is using. You probably want to know that. You want to understand where it came from and why, to really understand why consultation is important and why you need to think about it in your day-to-day when you're working with tribal governments. And so the guide really starts us off with that basic grounding in these fundamentals. So before we get to practical advice, I want to look really quickly at that legal basis and the legal parameters that USDA officials really have to work within when you're thinking about consultation. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about we can start talking about some of those things. Consultation is really the embodiment of two key concepts. First is tribal sovereignty, and the second is the federal trust responsibility to tribes. We start with this principle that tribal nations are sovereign governments. Just like any other governments, tribes have the inherent legal authority to make laws and policies that concern the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens within their jurisdiction. So when you think about a consultation with tribal elected officials, you'll be speaking with the highest elected officials, sometimes of a branch of a tribal government. It's not always a one-to-one match, but you could think of this as an analogy, if you wanted to, in US federal government terms, as speaking with a sitting US president or a senator or a congressional House representative. These are high elected officials who are responsible for day-to-day governance of all of their citizens. And when those elected officials from tribes are dialoguing formally with USDA officials, that is a government-to-government discussion. So you'll see sometimes it's called a government-to-government relationship or a nation-to-nation relationship. That's the way that we've chosen to title this guide. That refers to that work of governments that's happening when tribal elected officials and USDA officials come together to sit and consult. That's also, just as a fun aside, the reason that consultation is actually specifically exempted from the Federal Advisory Committee Act. If you've thought about that or had that in your training as a Fed, and you've heard of it, consultation is actually exempt from that because it's governments doing what governments do. They're governing. They're coming together to discuss governmental affairs. And that's what makes consultation a special process. It really recognizes tribal sovereignty right at the heart of the dialogue. So that's our first concept, and we talk about that in the guide. We also really talk about the importance of understanding the unique relationship that tribes have with the federal government. We describe part of this relationship as a federal trust responsibility, and we go into some detail about what that means as part of the guide. This legal obligation of a federal trust responsibility is what the federal government owes to tribal nations as a result of over 400 treaties, as well as land cessions and takings. This responsibility is something that is described in Supreme Court cases going back to the 1830s. It's also been incorporated into federal statutes by Congress. And part of that trust responsibility is acknowledging tribes' inherent sovereignty and then working with tribes as government-to-government partners to address issues. So consultation is a really important way to fulfill that trust responsibility because it provides that forum for problem solving, for partnership development, and ultimately better policies from USDA and better service to tribal citizens, which also, by the way, fulfills the trust responsibility that the federal government has to tribes. So those two concepts are really, really important when we think about consultation because consultation gives life to those two things. So if we want to go back a little bit more, and we've thought about treaties, we've thought about Supreme Court cases and federal laws being the primary legal basis for consultation. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about not just those broad historical concepts, but what we currently look to as the modern basis for consultation. Right now, we're going to look first at Executive Order 13175. I think anybody who works in Indian country and works with tribal leaders knows this one pretty much like the back of your hand. This is the contemporary legal basis for consultation applying to federal agencies. All federal agencies have to follow this guidance. It was issued in 2000. So for 23 years now, it has served as a basis for how and when federal agencies consult with tribes across multiple presidential administrations that have continued to uphold it. It is fairly broad, though. If you take a look at it, you'll see that. But we've had a series of presidential memoranda that have required all federal departments to have their own policies, and that's how USDA was developed initially. Currently, if you look at USDA's departmental guidelines, there's a particularly big one is 1350-002. However, if you're playing USDA Jeopardy or you just want to impress some really nerdy friends at a party, you might also want to remember that 1350-002 clarifies two other existing USDA regulations. That's 1350-001 and 1340-007. those are still active, but your primary guidance and parameters for USDA as an agency when it comes to interacting with tribes and doing consultation is going to come from 1350-002. I will say we know that USDA is working on an updated departmental regulation that was part of some consultations back in 2021 and 2022. So as soon as that's released, we'll of course update this guide to accommodate any changes. But for now, this guide, just know that it follows USDA's DRs. So we definitely took a look at those and worked with them to develop this guidance. So if you're thinking about making sure that this is complying with anything you have to comply with as an agency, don't worry about it, we've got you covered. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carly for some really good practical advice as to how to carry out this legal responsibility. So Carly, over to you.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, so Erin did a really good job kind of laying the foundation for what, the legal concepts and are surrounding the whole idea of consultation and why it's critical. And I like to call it, capital C consultation. There's a formal process in place that really solidifies that recognition of that government to government relationship and treats tribes as the sovereigns that they are. But we know that, what's written on paper and what the executive orders and the law says, well, how do we put it into practice? What does that mean when we're actually getting to the table, or even before that, in order to make sure that we're having a meaningful consultation and to be sure that we're sharing that information? So, some of the frequent questions that we get are, what's the difference between a listening session and a consultation? And the responses to all these questions listed on the page are included within this consultation guide. But we know that there's a formal difference between a listening session and a consultation. When we talk about consultation, like Erin had mentioned, it really boils down to tribal leadership sitting at the table and consulting with USDA or other federal agency officials who have the authority to make decisions in the context of that specific topic. And anything outside of those parameters is not a consultation, definitely not a capital C consultation that meets those requirements listed by the law, by the executive orders, and by the internal guidance. If it's something that's set up similar to a consultation, but you have people participating who are not in fact elected leaders or do not hold proxies on behalf of those leaders, that usually ends up being a listening session. And both can be valuable. And frequently a listening session will occur, in not in conjunction with, but right next to consecutive with a consultation in order to maximize participation. And that's valuable in instances where a consultation topic may be informed not only by elected tribal officials through a consultation process, but where a listening session opportunity would also possibly allow tribal employees or tribal citizens or subject matter experts to be able to participate in a way that would be informative to that process. And so those two things are very different. There's different protections associated with that. You heard Erin mention FACA, that consultations are not subject to. Listening sessions do not enjoy the same type of protections that a consultation would. And so it's important to make sure that you're following the legal parameters associated with a consultation and ensuring the appropriate people are participating, because if there's a deviation from that, you risk losing that protection that's available through the law for those government to government meetings that do specifically meet that consultation requirement. And so we get into the weeds and distinguish further between what a consultation is and what a consultation is not, what a listening session is, and what an informal lowercase c consultation might be considered as well. And so in a formal consultation, we talked about, who should be speaking. That should be elected tribal leaders, but it may, if an elected tribal leader has their employees or staffers with them that they would like to defer to, that's a way for for additional folks to be able to participate with the authority of that tribal leader or tribal official by recognizing those individuals, or if there is a participant who has a proxy that's appropriately executed by tribal leadership to represent that tribe's interest. And so that's just an example, and we really get into quite a few different particularities and nuances associated with consultations, things that we've seen come up frequently, things that we've heard feedback from on our tribal officials and citizens who've been participating as well. So what is best practices in regard to consultation? Always, 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 it requires good communication with tribal leaders about what they want with regard to a consultation. how they want that consultation to go, and being able to deliver on that as much as those laws and regulations allow. It includes making sure that your timing is appropriate, not only for appropriate notice, but also, scheduling time of the year. Different tribes, in the context of different topics, have different priorities and different schedules. There may be, cultural ceremonial practices that are going on certain times of the year. So it would make sense to be cognizant of that and try to schedule around that. Now, we understand there's 574 federally recognized tribes across the United States. Every tribe is different. Every tribe has its own cultural, history and background and practices. And so it may make sense to be considerate of who would be interested in participating. Are we going to have multiple locations for this particular consultation? And how does this work? And so that's an example of some of the things to consider. And so when we're talking about the consultation process, there's a few ways that can be initiated. Tribes always have the opportunity to say, hey, USDA or other federal agency, we'd like to have a consultation on this particular topic, policy, process, regulation, or rule that's impacting us in a certain way, and we want to have a conversation about that. Maybe there's a deficiency in the administration of a program. Maybe there is a conflict with the way a rule or a procedure or policy is drafted that does not work well for Indian country. Those are just a couple of examples. USDA as an agency has the ability to initiate. That can frequently occur through the rulemaking process. That makes a lot of sense, and it's actually required. If there is a rule that has the potential to impact a tribe, then that federal agency that is working on that rule or regulation should be initiating that consultative process to get feedback from tribes. Other federal agencies can follow that same suit, and then also emergency actions would warrant a consultation process as well, with the understanding that due process timelines as far as appropriate notice really need to be considered within that emergency action timeframe in order to be as timely as possible within that consideration. And so when consultations are initiated, Indian country is predicated on relationships. And having that knowledge base of who has a particular interest or who has, knowledge with regard to a topic that may warrant consultation is really critical to being better informed about how to go about a consultation. It may even make sense to reach out individually to those tribal leaders or elected officials in an informal context to say, hey, we're thinking about this. Is there a need for it? What topics, would you think should be discussed through this process in order to really be informed prior to starting the formal consultation process at the very beginning when it comes to issuing notice and Dear Tribal Leader letters. What is a Dear Tribal Leader letter? That's what we call those, but it's essentially a notice to a tribal leader that a consultation is coming up. We go into depth about what should be included in that Dear Tribal Leader letter and when it should come out. It should be compliant with agency policy, at least 30 days notice in advance. It should contain as much information as possible about what the topics of discussion are going to be. If there's any informative questions or briefing materials that are available that are generated by the consulting agency, those should be included either within the letter or as an enclosure to the letter, in addition to electronic links for follow-up. Sometimes it even makes sense to include the proxy form if there is an expectation that maybe subject matter employees would be filling in for tribal leadership, or if there is a need for multiple voices at the table for that to be included. And so that the Dear Tribal Leader letter really is a component of that pre-consultation process. But there's also things to consider with regard to scheduling the consultation. Like I discussed previously, multiple platforms are encouraged. Multiple locations are encouraged, especially if the topic is broad-based and broad-reaching across Indian country and has the potential to impact multiple tribes in different ways. It may make sense to have in-person consultations hosted at a regional level across the United States, and then also have one or two or more opportunities for virtual consultation, which would allow additional folks to participate. We also get into a discussion about other considerations before consultation, what to think about from a cultural perspective, how to be inclusive, what kind of language should be used, and how have a follow-up source in case anybody needs more information about the consultation, the topic, the schedule, the timeline, and the consulting officials will be participating. So during the consultation, this is really critical. Having cultural competency across the board, whether you are a consulting official, whether you are a federal employee who is attending to be able to assist and aid in the process, whether you're a subject matter expert or a tribal citizen or even a tribal leader, there's good information to know about how to understand and respect cultural norms and traditions, especially if a tribe is hosting that consultation on their reservation or tribal community or within one of their properties. Prioritizing tribal leadership, especially elders, is critical to working in Indian country. We really take a big perspective of respect to our elders based on their longevity and their experience, living in the United States as a tribal person, and also their experience and background within the subject matter that the consultation is engaging in. It's really important to be mindful, very important to be respectful, and also give your undivided attention. Some folks may have traveled a long way to get there, and some folks may have been experiencing hardship as a basis of the rule, regulation, or issues surrounding that topic of consultation for a long time. And it's important to give that space and give that respect for people to share their experience and also be cognizant of the outcomes that may be associated with that, and be brainstorming, what opportunities may exist within your agency to really serve those folks in a better way. But that doesn't mean that tribal leaders won't come in with an idea about a solution for themselves. And so it's important to listen not only from the issue vocalization perspective, but also from the solution perspective. And so after the consultation, it's important to identify follow-up. We've heard a lot of tribal leaders tell us, we hear from consulting officials, oh, well, I'll take that back. But then there's never any follow-up at the agency level after the consultation occurs. And so it's important not only in that follow-up to identify the cultural differences, identify the date that follow-up is going to occur, and indicate what reports that people can expect to come out of that, and actually issue those reports. There's a variety of other items to consider when it comes to consultation follow-up, and it's really important to make sure that the people who are participating in that consultation have that decision-making authority and the ability to actually engage appropriately. If an agency is sending folks to do a consultation that don't actually have decision-making authority and don't have the ability to impact or influence that topic that's at issue through the consultation, it is not a respectful use of time of tribal leadership to invite them to come to a consultation where there's no teeth available to actually affect change associated with that topic. And I think I'll kick it back over to Erin now to take over for consultations at the state level.
Great. Thank you, Carly. Yeah, Carly gave some amazing guidance, so I definitely hope anybody listening who's thinking about consultation was hearing that and taking notes, and we'll check back in the guide later, because those practical considerations really do help make consultations a success. So we're going to talk a little bit about states, because this is also in the guide. Although we wrote this guide for USDA and with USDA in mind, we also wanted to make sure that we mentioned that there are some pieces of USDA programs that occasionally may even require state consultation, which is a little strange. Sometimes I think for state officials, because and for federal officials and tribes, because the federal tribal relationship is the one that we really focus on in this space, right? That's the one that's unique. That's where the trust responsibility lies with the federal government, not with the state government. That relationship is truly just between tribes and the federal government. So state governments, generally speaking, do not have legal authority to act on tribal lands, but they also don't have that trust obligation, because that is at the federal level. That doesn't mean, though, that state government action doesn't impact tribal governments. It absolutely does. It also doesn't mean that states are wholly exempt from consulting. As I mentioned, sometimes Congress can require that. So a good example is the Food Nutrition Act of 2008 as amended, which requires state agencies who are operating the SNAP Nutrition Ed program, that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or formerly food stamps, the nutrition education portion of that, State agencies are required to consult with tribes as they prepare their annual SNAP-Ed plan. That's in the statute. That's something Congress has required of states. That's really important because tribes actually can't access SNAP-Ed funds directly. So service of tribal citizens through this program either ends up being in partnership with a state, a tribe receiving money through a state pass-through and partnership, or tribal citizens just go underserved or unserved by the program. And unfortunately, that is something that tribal leaders have raised in continuous consultation with USDA for years. These consultations across state levels just simply don't happen a lot of the time. States will prepare a state SNAP-Ed plan and simply not have consulted with a tribe in any way that could be called timely, meaningful, substantive, or even at all. Sometimes there's absolutely no outreach. It varies by state. So that's something that tribal leaders have talked to USDA about frequently. There's a lot more detail about this on the guide. The short version is that USDA is currently working with tribal leaders to remedy this issue. They are trying some new tactics this year to make sure those consultations happen. Those things are really in progress right now. So it's one of those things that I think tribal leaders are monitoring to see if they're successful, and we certainly hope that they are. But we wanted to highlight here too that one of the things that this guide can do is not only be useful to USDA staff at the federal level, but also for state agency staff who are operating and working with USDA programming. The executive order 13175, the USDA departmental regs, they might not apply to a state agency, but we still think what we've put together here is a solid foundation for state officials who do have those consultation requirements, like the state SNAP-Ed plan development, or for state officials who are simply just interested in honoring tribal sovereignty and initiating better dialogue with tribal leaders. I think that state action, as I said, does definitely impact tribes. And so where there are opportunities for state officials to make better relationships and do consultation, this can also be a practical guide for states. So, and as we transition to questions, I do want to leave you with an excellent example, though, of a consultation body and consultation practice that has been done very well that USDA can actually look to right now for an example. And that's the food distribution program on Indian reservations. There's a tribal leaders consultation work group, or TLCWG, too many acronyms. But that body has been sitting in consultation with USDA 3 times a year since 2016. So over 7 years and 3 presidential administrations, there's been a series of tribal leaders from tribes all over Indian country who have come together to sit in consultation with USDA officials and do that government to government work of solving problems in this program. This program is a really critical piece of the food safety security net in Indian country. It provides on average about 80,000 tribal households with packages of food every month. It serves extremely vulnerable citizens within tribal communities. It has a high percentage of elders and children under the age of 18 in the home that use this program. So it's something that tribal leaders have cared very much about. They want to make sure that their citizens are receiving the service that they deserve through this program. And there have been some problems with it over the years. It's been a 50-year program. And thanks to this dialogue and partnership that tribal leaders have been able to develop with USDA officials, there are more tribally produced, traditional, and culturally appropriate foods in this program today than at any point in its 50-year history. And that is really all down to solid tribal leadership and some really relentless advocacy as well from tribal communities themselves, from the program managers within tribal government structures that actually run this program. The Indian tribal organizations across Indian country have been able to partner with their own tribal leaders and be those subject matter experts. Carly was talking about who speaks at a consultation. In this particular body, those tribal leaders bring their subject matter experts with them to these consultations because they know that those are the people who are working every single day on this program. They see the issues that are coming up. They have concrete examples of what's going on. And they also have really good ideas about how to fix things because they're the people who are doing the work. So they bring their subject matter experts with them. They call on them to help explain problems that are going on. And because of that structure and because of the tribal leadership that's gone on and the ability of USDA to sit back and listen over the years and actually implement those tribally led solutions, those problems have been solved. There are still things that they're working on in that body, but there's been a lot of progress. So I think that's a really great example to leave you with of something that's going on right now and happens 3 times a year. And if you ever want to drop in on a consultation, the next one will be in December alongside Intertribal Agriculture Council's annual membership meeting in Las Vegas, Nevada, and there'll eventually be more information about that on the Office of Tribal Relations website, but I wanted to flag it for you because it is a really good example of something that's working very well. So I will leave you with that, and I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, so I will pass it back to Mary Bell for that. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, we just wanted to put on here where you can download it. We are also put in comments a link so you can go and check it out that way. And then also, like she said, we are opening the floor to comments and questions right now. There can be a lag, so we'll give folks a few minutes to get any questions in that they may have.
So we have a question. Are the framing papers from USDA provided to tribal leaders in adequate time to prepare for consultations? And how could this improve?
That's a great question. I think, the development of framing papers, I feel like has been a recent development in USDA OTR at Tribal Relations. They can be very helpful when they do get released on time. I think, when Carly was speaking about that practical advice, she mentioned if there are those documents, they really need to come out with the invitation, either as an enclosure or directly in the body of any kind of invitation, because that gives tribal leaders plenty of time, not just to view it for themselves, but as I mentioned, they're going to want to talk to their subject matter experts, their program staff within their government. I wouldn't expect, President Biden necessarily to know what was going on within a particular office at USDA because he's got other things that he's doing. But if he had to go to a meeting, you'd probably want a briefing on it from somebody who did know. And in much the same way, a tribal leader is going to come to a consultation wanting to talk to their staff or ideally bring their staff with them so that they have those people there ready to bring those examples, ask those questions. And that's really important because it facilitates that substantive part of the dialogue. Otherwise, you're just kind of talking past each other and no problems really get solved. So I would say to the extent possible, yeah, those really need to come out with letters. And I don't think they're really doing that right now. I know that clearance processes within USDA require legal review. I know that can take a while. However, I think from the tribal side of things, what we hear is that they just don't come out fast enough right now. So, Carly, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that too.
No, I think that pretty well covers it. I think that it's really part of being cognizant of what that time frame is that the executive order requires and that the internal guidance requires there at the agency level. And so having a good game plan ready to roll out in advance with the understanding that those processes can take some time. So it's not a matter of, starting 45 days or even 60 days in advance. It may be something that, you're looking 90 days out or more to ensure that a consultation is scheduled and that the appropriate people are invited or at the table with the appropriate information. And so the timeline as far as advance notice is concerned is just, that's not the starting point. That is the notice point, and the planning and preparation happens before that.
Oh no, someone mentioned that the link isn't working, so we'll try and resend that out and see if we can get that to fix.
Yeah. A follow-up question to the first question was, why do people have to go through the process of becoming a proxy to be able to speak in a consultation?
That's another really good question. That goes back to that focus on government to government dialogue, right? So in order to make sure that it's governments at the table, it's elected officials from tribes, and it's USDA officials with delegated authority, those decision makers at the table. The reason the proxy forms are necessary is to make sure that you're preserving that linkage to an elected official. So if you're serving in a position that's not necessarily elected, that's where the proxy form comes in. It makes sure that we're saying this is a special discussion because it is between governments. It's not a listening session or a meeting. It is held to a higher legal standard. So it's really a preservation of tribal sovereignty is the way that we look at it, because it is, again, consultation at its heart is saying we recognize that tribal governments are sovereign nations. So that's where that comes from.
I wanted to add from a comment perspective, we talked about consultation at the federal level and we talked about state agency consultation. There's also consideration for an opportunity for consultation to occur at the state level for federally administered programs. And so some USDA programs are administered at the state level. And I'm thinking of, NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, or FSA programs, Farm Service Agency. And a lot of times the feedback that we've heard from tribal producers and tribal leadership is the national policy may be appropriate, but for some reason the implementation is not working at the state level of that federally administered program. And so a consultation process that's engaged in at the state level through these federally administered programs may make a lot of sense to assist those state programs or the programs that are being administered at the state level to better understand how to best serve tribal communities within that state. Like I said before, there's 574 federally recognized tribes found across the United States, different histories, different cultural practices, different land bases, different interests with regard to agriculture and food systems and other topics that are contained within programmatic administration at USDA. So it may make a lot of sense for a program that's administered at that state level to be engaging with tribes from a more local perspective in order to better administer those programs and better connect tribes with those resources and programmatic opportunities that occur.
I think we've got that link fixed if anyone wants to try it.
Thank you for that, Tish. We've had some good questions coming through. So for those of you who may have just joined, you can ask questions by just commenting on the post that you're watching this on. And if you're watching this later on when we're not live, my email is listed there on the slide. So you're welcome to send an email and I will get in touch with whoever and connect y'all. So we welcome questions later on as well.
So the next question is it ever considered a burden on tribes to have so many consultations where tribal leadership needs to be present along with program directors? Are there new ways to reduce that burden or are there ways to reduce that burden and efforts at coordination or efficiency?
Yeah, I think that there absolutely are. And I think there was a point in early 2022, at least, that I think we were kind of hearing from tribal leadership, like, hey, we're kind of consulted out right now. A part of that had to do with the release of President Biden's memorandum that required consultation on consultation. It's great to have those consultations, but I think there were so many of them happening across the federal government that it was a little bit exhausting and overwhelming for tribal leaders. I think one of the things, and I'll let Carly speak to this more because it's more of the practical guidance side, but I think one of the things that we do recommend in the guide is, where possible, think about trying to locate these consultations, first of all, in person where possible. Second of all, like going to a tribe is best if you can, but if not, like looking at in-person opportunities where there are going to be a lot of tribal leaders, like paying attention to common events that are happening in Indian country. Like we just wrapped Self-Gov, for example, last month. It moves around every year, but it's usually around the same time. And so, USDA officials could maybe take a look at those calendars, see where those things are happening, just because we know that tribal leaders are extremely busy and they may not be able to go to multiple events, but you could do a series maybe in one location. So
yeah, and we did. Oh, sorry, Carly. I was just going to say that we did include those in the guide.
Yeah, those recommendations are included in there, but piggybacking off of other existing tribal events is a good way to really maximize the opportunity to make that contact with tribal officials without being too disruptive schedule-wise. A lot of times the consultations that are scheduled in conjunction with other tribal events occur possibly in the evening or as a parallel session to a conference schedule that's going on during that time. There is a consultation process that I'm thinking of that incorporates subject matter, but we've seen evidence that there isn't a cognizant understanding of how to contact the people that may be most affected by this particular potential rule. And so making sure that the subject matter that's at issue, the schedule of events is consistent with folks that would be interested in participating or available to participate. Especially when we're talking about agriculture, if there is an interest to include perspectives of tribal producers through a listening session process, may make sense not to schedule something in the Midwest in June, July, or August. Those summer months are really critical for on-farm harvest practices and working cattle and livestock because of the growing season. It may, make more sense to schedule something in the fall or winter. Vice versa. If you're looking to do something in the heat of the Southwest, it might be too hot to work, and maybe that's a good time to schedule a consultation to be indoors. And so just kind of be thoughtful about what the topic is, who you're choosing to engage, and the best way to really leverage those opportunities from a geographic, from a cultural, from a practical perspective.
Okay, we're still trying to figure out what's going on with the website. Sorry about that. We just got a brand new website today, so it's very exciting, but a lot of changes happening. So we'll get that fixed on the IT side of things and update this post as soon as that's working. So sorry about that. I think we'll open the floor for maybe one more question potentially. So if anyone has any dying last question that they want to put out there, the floor is all yours.
Mary, while we're waiting on that question to come in, Aaron did a good job pointing out the tribal working group with regard to consultation on the food distribution program. There are other standing committees like that that engage in that consultative process through a nominations process. And I'm specifically thinking of the Tribal Conservation Advisory Councils at the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so there's regional opportunities to get involved to provide feedback to NRCS through a consultative process in order to facilitate that. But I think that format has the opportunity to be replicated in different formats across multiple agencies at USDA, especially as we're seeing additional opportunities for self-governance come through, especially as we're seeing additional opportunities for tribal feedback and participation with regard to executive orders and administrative priorities. And so, taking a look at those two models as an example of ways to have more continuous consultation on a particular or specific agency or program, practice, or policy, that can really be an effective way to have that continuity of dialogue that's going to be impactful and, continuing in a way that it's really going to promote that progress and success for better service and better opportunity. So regional tribal conservation advisory councils and, that FDIPR consultation group as well is really important. So take a look at those too.
Carly, is there also opportunities within FSA to get on those boards so that there will be a tribal representation there?
Sure. So when we're talking about representation, this isn't necessarily something that lines up with a consultative process, but an opportunity for tribal citizens and tribal producers to participate. There's been encouragement for tribal folks to run for their county committee, that COC, the county committee within their area, if they're interested in participating and being influential. And one of the great things about the county committees is if the district, or the LAA as it's called, overlaps with a tribal reservation or is contained within a tribal reservation, any tribal citizen is eligible to vote within that election. You don't have to be a tribal producer. You don't have to be signed up with an FSA number to participate. And that's that recognition of that government to government relationship and having that appropriate representation. So definitely encourage people who are interested in serving on their FSA county committees to check out that opportunity. And we're also a resource to provide additional information in that context.
And I put this in the comments, but the period does end soon. I think it's early August. So definitely get in there and get nominations in, because the more Indian country folks we have on there, the more Indian country's voices can be heard. So.
And Maribel, it sounds like some people have been able to use the link now.
Perfect. I think we got it fixed. Awesome. All right, well, I kind of think we're naturally coming to a close. No more questions are trickling in, but if you guys do have questions later on, again, my email is listed here on this slide. Shoot us an email. We would love to get you in touch with whoever to help answer your questions. So Miigwech, thank you for joining us today. We're so excited to launch the consultation guide to the world today and glad you could join us. We hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you so much.